it seems like a wonderful setting, the American Library in Paris, to talk about a book, Evil Flowers, which has been published in the United States. And while her work, generally speaking, has been translated into many languages in different parts of the world, this book, with a particularly French title and with a kind of, I don't want to say French atmosphere, but in which Baudelaire plays at least some role. He's in there in the book, glaring at you at one point, very literally. That, you know, it's been published in the United States, but it hasn't yet made its way to France. So this feels like a privileged little bubble to have the conversation in between languages, between cultures. Maybe that's a good place to begin in terms of the book and its title, Evil Flowers. I have my own thoughts about that, but perhaps you'd mind commenting how this book and why this has this, at least this trace of Baudelaire in it.
Well, I don't know. It's a matter of writing. I don't think I ever really know when I start what's going to happen. I think that's one of the great pleasures of writing. I am really bad at plotting things out on beforehand. It's kind of just the writing that interests me. But Baudelaire has been a part of my life since I started studying literature, and his I was going to say friend, Arthur Rimbaud. I wrote my master's thesis on Rimbaud, his Une saison en enfer, and I have been very. They have played a great role in my kind of both the academic career, but also my literary work in different ways. I think one of the first I stumbled across Baudelaire was through an American short story writer. Maybe you're all familiar with him, Richard Brautigan. It was in a preface. How do you pronounce preface? Do you say
preface?
Preface. It was in a preface to a Baudelaire. I think it was a collection of prose poems, and there was a short poem by Richard Brautigan, which was about. I think it's something like. Brautigan has a cycle of 9 poems, which is called. Oh God, I have forgotten the name of the cycle, but it's about Baudelaire doing different things, not very Baudelarian things, I imagine. At one point, he follows an asylum. I think I'm writing about it in the short story collection as well. But in this poem, he was opening up a hamburger stand in San Francisco. And people would come in and say, "Give me a hamburger." This is a quote, with plenty of onions on it. And Baudelaire would hand them a flour burger instead, and people would say, I think I'm quoting it very badly now, but people would say, "Give me a hamburger with plenty of onions," and he would give them a flour burger instead, and they would say, "What kind of a hamburger stand is this?" And that was the kind of place that I was looking for with my texts. I was looking for that kind of hamburger stand that would give people what they didn't want. So I think that's also how I use Baudelaire in Evil Flowers. He's kind of used himself as that kind of flour burger, I think. Yeah, I'm just talking away now. That's okay. It was a beginning.
Yeah, I love the fact that you mentioned that you don't know, you haven't necessarily generated a blueprint for your work in advance, that you don't know what's happening. To me, this is part of the experience of reading her work. If some of you may have done so already, others of you, you're ripe for the discovery. I mean, that's actually one of the benefits of reading the fiction, is You don't know where she's going either. And it goes in funny and strange places, like that response that you'd imagine. I think there's a tradition as well, perhaps in Anglophone writing, that I mean, Lydia Davis can do this. They're just names of just people who are able to somehow seem to be channeling something that is unpredictable, or simply following some other external lead, the characters or the writing, which is a pleasure to experience, precisely because it's impossible to sense where it will go or what kind of actions it may take, what the result might be. And you'll get an example of this right away, because I think it's a nice way to begin the evening, is perhaps by talking about or hearing a little bit from one of the stories in here. And this is the first story in the collection, which has a very memorable opening. And I'll read the opening first in English, and then Gunnhild will read just the first couple of sentences in Norwegian, so you can get a sense of the original. It's called Birds. As I sat on the toilet menstruating, a fairly large part of my brain fell down into the toilet bowl. I'd seen brains on TV, so could easily differentiate a piece of brain from a piece of mucosa. There it was, not black and clumpy, but brownish pink and shiny. I said nothing when I went back into the kitchen. I just sat down and ate my tacos as if nothing had happened. I did a few quick checks. I'm sorry, it's the word taco makes me want to laugh. It always happens. I did a few quick checks to make sure I was still functioning. Did I understand requests like, pass me the sour cream, or can I have the taco sauce, please? I ran through the names and ages of everyone around the table, my husband and 3 children, and I looked out of the window to see if I still knew where I was. Then, as I chewed, I quickly estimated the dimensions of the kitchen, rattled off the alphabet in my head, ran through the lineage on my side of the family and Tom's. Everything seemed to be in working order, but later, when I went back up to my office and sat down to work, I saw something hanging from the yellow desk light that I didn't recognize. From the way it was hanging, it must have been there for some time. It certainly wasn't new. It was a peculiar shape, a kind of half moon with an uneven curve and a kind of tip at one end. The tip was black, the underside was yellow, and the top side a darker yellow and black, and some white with something that resembled a human eye in it. Only when I looked closer, it lacked the white of an eye. Across what I would call the back of the half moon were some cuts that looked like parallel grooves which ran back toward the flat end. When Hans popped his head in around the door a little later, I took the thing off the lamp and held it up. Hans was 10, so might possibly know what the thing was, if he wasn't too young. What is this, Hans? I said. He looked at me, a little nervous. It's a kind of tit, but I'm not sure what kind. Please don't get angry. Angry? I said. Why would I be angry? You normally get angry when I don't know exactly what kind of bird it is or what sound it makes. Oh, I said. So, what's a tit? Mommy, you're the one who can answer that, he said, exasperated. I can only tell you it's a bird. A small bird from the tit family. He threw up his hands and closed the door. So the thing in front of me was something he called a bird from the tit family. None of it made any sense to me. I Googled bird. I was presented with a list of things similar to the thing that is called bird in the singular, birds in the plural. It was a living creature, and I could see that they all had that tip coming out of what I'd come to realize was their head, but the tip varied in size and shape and was actually called a beak, and birds could fly. I had to laugh out loud when I discovered that. These were creatures that could actually fly. I heard a knock on the door. My husband stuck his head in. Hans said that you asked him what sort of tit it was, Tom said. Nina, surely there's a limit to how many categories you expect them to know. Isn't it enough that they know it's a tit? Yes, of course, I said. He seemed to soften. I know that your defense is coming up, and I understand. I really do. But you can be certain that you won't be asked to classify the tit family. He came over and gave me a hug. He looked at my screen, which was full of images of different birds. He laughed. Back to basics, I see, he said, and left the room.
I'm just going to read a few sentences. Da jeg satt på doen og menstruerte, falt en ganske stor bit av hjernen min ned i doskåla. Jeg hadde jo sett hjerner på TV og kunne lett skilje hjernebit fra slimhinnebit. Der lå han, ikke svart og klumpete, men brunrosa og skinende. Jeg sa ingenting om det da jeg kom inn på kjøkkenet. Bare sette meg til å ete taco som vanlig. There's the word taco again.
It's less funny in Norwegian. So, of course, the key issue here is actually she's preparing for a dissertation in ornithology. So it's rather startling for her to suddenly not recognize birds anymore. But of course, I think what is startling and unpredictable is the very opening line of the story that you've heard. And so I guess a question that has more to do about craft than anything else. Do you begin with a line like that in a story, or is this because even I imagine for members of the public, they don't know where it's going. Having read this already, I actually know what's going to happen, but in one sense, I also don't know where it's going.
No, but in that particular story, it was very difficult because I had, okay, I'm going to try to give two answers because very often I write short stories out of the first sentence. The first sentence is what comes first, and then I just have to try to figure out what is this, who is speaking, and what is kind of running through their lives, and who is speaking. That's the kind of the question that a first line will give me, and that's the sort of line that can just come anywhere at any time, and then I just have to write it down, and then something will evolve. And sometimes it takes 10 years before I kind of figured out what the first sentence actually meant, or who was speaking, or so the first sentences, particularly in short stories, for me are very, very important. And sometimes I can also know by kind of the sound or the rhythm of the first sentence that it's actually going to be a short story, because my novels never start that way. I never start with a first sentence in a novel. I kind of tug at the first 3 pages for a couple of years before I'm able to move on. But this particular short story was very difficult to write. I had an idea. I had been working on a few sketches. I wanted short stories that were not classical short stories, that were kind of moving. I was trying to find a way to write short stories that would be digressive and open and moving kind of in a zigzag way, where the protagonists would kind of lose their way, would kind of be very easily distracted and be I was kind of I was objecting to my own feeling of having to write short stories in a short story way. And also I think to a kind of a notion what the short story really is. And I wanted to write something that was open and porous and self-contradictory. And so that was kind of a goal, or a kind of an idea I had. And for this short story, I had been taking notes. I was at home. I was quite ill. I had, what do you call it, bronchitis, where I was just coughing and I was going on antibiotics. I was visiting my parents, and my father was practicing for a church concert. He would handle Messiah, and that's what the father does in the short story as well. So I was kind of writing notes of what was happening, and my father is also very fond of birds, and birds has been a very large part of my childhood, kind of trying to listen to different bird sounds and classify them. I have never been able to do that. I don't think I've learned a single bird phrase yet. But then this, so when I was doing research for this short story, which didn't have a beginning and it didn't have an end, it had just my father practicing Handel and the idea of birds, I suddenly came across the common snipe, which is very important in the short story, in just a little while. And then I suddenly found out that she would, I would call them she, that it would, when the common snipe alights, it flies in a zigzag pattern. So it was really, really strange, because I suddenly found a symbol, or a kind of a spirit animal of the short story movement that I was looking for. But still, I didn't know where to go with the short story. I just had the father, the handle, and the bird. And then I think, and then
So no menstruation at this point.
no menstruation at this point. But then the first sentence came in like that. It just kind of it came in. That's the perfect way to describe it. Just appeared out of nowhere. And that was, and then I knew that that was the first phrase of this material that I've been working on with the bird and practicing of the handle, because it would kind of ground the more abstract, I think, things that were going on in my kind of objection against the short story form. So I kind of grounded it in a person who would have kind of a physical a mishap happen to her body, and to kind of try to combine the very kind of, I would say, how to say this in English, the banal and the body and the not so beautiful as and not the menstruation is not something you'd maybe, I don't know. I wanted to highlight the menstruation. So it's but it also kind of gave it kind of a necessary starting point in a body to kind of be very philosophical about it. Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it's quite interesting too, because of course these stories draw from realism, but they're not necessarily realistic. And so in a story like this, it's as though there's a premise that's inherent in this opening sentence, and the rest of the story will bear that out. Of course, it's also true in several other stories that the narrator can do what she likes at any point, precisely because the focus of this short fiction is not going to be that of replicating the well-made story as it may be known, with a coherent beginning, middle, and end, which is not to say that there isn't narrative tension or situations that attract your attention, or even pathos. I mean, the end of the story, to me, is quite suggestive. I don't want to say allegorical, that would be going too far, but you're left with the loss of that's suggested by the very opening sentences. The woman is acquired that a body of knowledge through study. That's something that many of us who have ever been enthusiastic about something or have mastered some kind of area can understand, and that in one stroke it's all gone, which over the long term happens to all of us too. And of course that's something that happens to memory over time too, but being confronted with that loss is something that it doesn't end sentimentally in any way, but you're left with that absence, which she feels quite palpably at the end of the story. And I guess I'd like to ask a question about, because we're talking about short fiction, and you suggested already a kind of, Richard Brautigan, or I mentioned a couple, Lydia Davis is perhaps an example. There are traditions both of practitioners of short fiction, and then on the other hand, you might say practitioners of avant-garde or experimental or non-conventional fiction. And then there's the entire category of, I suppose, off-kilter, absurdist, humor in writing. Those individuals who are able to generate writing like that. Do you mind saying something about your sense of heritage? I suppose something in terms of the short story. Is this something that you feel associated directly with the Norwegian traditions of short fiction? Is this something that where's your short fiction coming from? I'm sorry, that was a long lead up, but that's the gist of the question.
Yeah, well, I do have the kind of the Norwegian tradition. We have a very strong tradition of the short story in Norway.
May I interrupt to ask another question immediately? Does that tradition resemble, because you were talking about not wanting to have this kind of conventional blueprint in terms of plot, is that identical? I'm very familiar with the American tradition of short story, in which that is a very present element. Is that identical in the Norwegian one?
I think the classical short story is the kind of the blueprint of the Norwegian short story. So I had a conversation with the Argentinian writer Samantha Schweblin, who also writes short story, and she comes from the kind of the Latin American branch of the short story, which is kind of from Borges and the more surrealist or absurd, fantastical tradition of short stories. And she said to me, "Well, you belong to my tradition," and I thought it was so fantastic of her to kind of include me in that, which I haven't read. I kind of had to admit that I haven't read so much of that either, but we do have representatives of the more absurd short story as well, but they're not as well read, I think, as the more traditional short story. And it was the more traditional short story writers that I read when I was younger, in school, for instance, and I was very influenced by them. But then I think I created my own tradition when I kind of merged my inspiration from James Joyce's Dubliners with the short stories of Franz Kafka. That was kind of the two different short story versions that kind of created my own space, I think. So that's and I was and also I have to mention I have a brother who is a writer. He's a couple of years younger than me, and he is I mean, if there's a kind of a stretch between complete absurd and complete realist, then I'm kind of in the middle, but he's in the complete absurd. He's and he writes short fiction, short stories as well, and they're and I've always been a big fan of his. so kind of in a kind of grew up with his. We grew up together, and I think he also influenced me a great deal with his writing. So there's and lately I've been reading. We talked about this earlier today, and I've been reading about Lydia Davis and Mary Ruefle and Joe Williams. A very strong American tradition of short. Well, in Norway we call it short prose. It's a kind of a label for prose that isn't long. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question about the part in relation to the whole. You mentioned not knowing where the story was going to go, or many of the stories will go when you start to write them. This book is advertised as a collection of short fiction, and yet they are threaded together by multiple patterns, by repetitions, by similar actions that occur between shifts of voice. You might say that they zig and they zag in similar ways. They may be going in completely different directions, but there's a movement that will resemble one story to the next. There is the running gag with Baudelaire. There is the voice that turns around in the middle of the story and is addressed to the reader of the story. In fact, it's not even subtle. I mean, one of the very early parts of the book is you have 4 sections called threads, right, in which each one is almost a commentary on the one previous to it. Can you speak of the architecture of this collection? Which is, I suppose, what I'm trying to say is this, while a collection of stories, it's not merely an assembly of short fiction, but it seems to function as a book with, however slim, a book's larger concerns and formal patterns. Is this something that you developed gradually, or is this? Can you say something about the making of the book as opposed to the generation of any individual story?
Well, I think it's I think rhythm and pattern is kind of the key words, and I don't really. That's something that will always evolve through the writing process, and I suddenly started noticing when I had been writing a couple of sketches and a couple of short stories that some things were turning up and I didn't know why. But then I kind of realized that they belong together because of them being they felt familiar. And also there's a lot of transformation. I think there's a lot of both anxiety for the transformation, but also there's, for instance, one short story where it's called okay, I'm gonna have to check what it's called. Can't remember what it's called in English. White. It's about a dove that becomes a crow. White dove becomes black crow. That's the title, and that's also the plot of the short story. It's a woman walking her Sunday walk, and then she sees a white dove in the middle of the road, and then she feels that the dove is watching her and listening to her, and while she is watching this dove, she can suddenly see a transformations into a black crow, beginning from the big front. This is the front of the of the animal, and then and that is something that she well, she's not scared of it, but it's kind of I think it's it's very typical for them, some threads in or a thread in the book, which is about transformation, and very often very silly transformations. There's also a museum that has kind of, which is called the National Museum. There's a kind of a nightmare for the director who is going to open the museum the next day, and then
there's a spoonerism in where the letters are mixed up in the piece of the National Museum.
Yeah. It's a nightmare for this director. He's kind of been proofreading old material, and and there's an error. So that's kind of both error and silly and stupid transformation, and very simple transformation, but also quite life-changing transformation with kind of, I mean, losing a part of your brain with all the knowledge you have to kind of defend yourself as an academic person. That is kind of the core of the book, I think. Kind of the emotional, kind of some search of stability or safe ground is something that a lot of the characters are looking for. But so that is kind of when I think all the different short stories are revolving around that in some way. But then suddenly I noticed that there was a lot of animals, a lot of different animals turning up. So that's kind of one way of noticing for myself that, okay, this belongs to the Evil Flowers project, because there's a lot of animals in it. So, and also plants. I never can. I mix the British and the American, and then and so the Norwegian cover had an extra cover. I don't know what this is called on the inside, with kind of a mix of all the different animals that you find in the book, because there's quite a lot, and that's the kind of what I'm trying to kind of explain, is how the pattern and the rhythm of a whole kind of develops naturally, just, and not because I don't plan it. I just kind of recognize it, and then in the end I can see that my mind has kind of been working for me without me kind of telling it what to do. Because, for instance, the animals tend to be offering some kind of stability, or some kind of it's a part of the natural world which will be there no matter what. And sometimes there's also, I think maybe you're going to read it afterwards if we have time. There's a tit, which becomes the stable point. So yeah,
That's quite funny too, because I think I'm going to read a very short piece to demonstrate something else that happened in response to quite a few of the stories, called protests. And I'll explain that in a moment. What's striking is, just as I think of it, of course, this is a story called Protest that follows another story. And the story that's just ended involves the shit of a blackbird. And of course, of the blackbird, and I'm thinking of the birds in the first story, and the tit that you had already mentioned, and of course the presence of birds throughout the entire work. And in fact, I think there's even a tit in this section as well. So that's very clear. It's as if the reader is doing the threading, but the stitches are somehow visible, that link the different stories. But okay, so I'm going to just find this. This is Protest. And as I've mentioned, it's not the only protest in this work. My next question has to do with this. This is immediately after the conclusion of another story. We hear with protest, or protest, that the previous text had such an unhappy ending. Unhappy endings drive us nuts, and we think that people who are let out a back door without even knowing they're being shown to the back door should be given a prize. Innocent and full of expectation, they have until now believed that they were being shown to the entrance of a palace or something, and are not prepared to find themselves suddenly outside a back door, looking down at a sad gravel backyard and the ugly, wobbly metal staircase that leads down to it. Instead, there should be a big prize of some sort behind the back door, not a large basket full of fruit and chocolate, as fruit rots so quickly, and nor should it be bathroom scales, a red geranium, a salt-cured leg of lamb, a lamp, or a toilet roll doll. No matter how beautiful the pink dress that's draped over the toilet roll, and a 25,000 krona check is not enough either, but it could, for example, be a vacation car, or maybe even a new house. We hope our protest will be taken into consideration. And there's this voice that emerges, sometimes in a section called the protest, but sometimes it's just at the end of the story, often speaking as we, in a kind of royal we, which expresses dissent with how things are being done in the story that you're reading. And it's quite fun, because it's both playful, it's metafictional in a way that isn't over-intellectualized, which is to say, it's not like you're going into a labyrinth of footnotes or look at me turning myself inside out. But you seem very conscious of the artifice of short fiction and determined to prevent the reader from somehow merging into what might otherwise be a story.
Yeah, that's a very good description, I think. Because I think I'm very interested in how to both create and dissolve the creation in the same movement. And I think some of the discussions in this book, and I think overall through my other books, is also about how we perceive, how perception is linked to language, and the errors of that are inherent in using language. And I'm quite I mean, I love fiction, but I'm also skeptical of it. And I think that's a way of discussing the I don't know how to express this. I get very frustrated when I feel like a writer is trying to squeeze me into something that I'm not. I want to have my own space. I'm reluctant when I read first person narrators that I feel are kind of creating some kind of intimacy between me and the narrating voice. At the same time, I love it. So, but it's a constant discussion I think I have, and I'm very fond of the metafictional of metafiction as such, actually, as a way of discussing what fiction is. But I also am very fond of kind of turning the metafiction into a fiction. So the metafiction of this short story collection is commenting on the short stories, but then creating a fiction out of it by placing it in a fictional analysis department. So the metafiction is kind of fictionalized, if that makes sense. So it's kind of a kind of wave-like ongoing discussion back and forth between creation and kind of taking the creation apart. And I think it's also a way of, kind of hoping that it creates kind of a distance, so the reader can make up their own mind instead of me kind of luring them into my own version of the reality, or if that makes sense. Yeah, kind of halfway makes sense, I think.
That's wonderful. I can't believe that we're almost out of time.
Oh.
I want to take advantage of the compression of these stories to read at least one more. And also part of this is you can actually get a sense of what she does. And Smith & Son has books for sale. And so after the event, you can not only pick up a copy of this entire collection, but have it signed, which I would recommend heartily. And here is a work called The Point. And then we can go to questions from the public. And yes, there's some animals in here. The poor girl. You see, everything around her turned into slime eels. Well, not everything, naturally, but most things. When she took her physics exam, the exam paper turned into slime eels. Then the desk turned into slime eels, and then the chair, and then the floor. When she was in a relationship that she thought was good, and that had not yet turned into slime eels, her boyfriend turned into slime eels. When she stood in a cosmetics shop and had picked up a bottle of shampoo to have a closer look, as it might help to deal with her unruly hair that never behaved as it should, it turned into slime eels. When she sat on the bus to Nesodden once on the way to see her little sister, the bus turned into slime eels, and then all the passengers turned into slime eels, and then finally the driver as well. As you probably realize, these are just a few examples of what turned into slime eels in her presence. We understand, Department of Analysis, that you might fumble to find some kind of explanation, as we have done, and get no further than the rather cold consolation that sometimes life feels like everything you touch turns into slime eels. But having scoured various explanation models, we seem to have ended up here. All this actually happened in the life of this girl whose experience was that everything around her turned into slime eels, as though any opening was closed by this, slime eels. And when we consider how hard it is for us to accept this simple premise, surely this is peanuts compared with how tired and fed up the girl was with everything turning into slime eels. When will anything just be what it is? She found herself thinking one evening as she stood under a streetlight trying to find out what the next bus home was on her phone, which immediately started to turn into a slime eel. Already the next day, she got an answer the day she observed a great tit in the forest, and the great tit did not turn into a slime eel. The girl stood quiet as a mouse, terrified that the bird would turn into a slime eel, and watched the great tit peck at an apple on the ground with a pine needle in its beak, and out of the hole in the apple came a grub, not a slime eel, but a grub, which the great tit ate. It was a small bird, yellow-breasted and black-headed, small, active, and real, and itself in every moment that the girl stood there. What a joy! Something had not turned into a slime eel. After this, she went back to the forest frequently to look for the great tit, and if she was lucky, she would spot it. And the great tit continued to be the great tit, a surprisingly stable point, a point she could build her whole life around, as though she were finally sitting at a window and looking out.
Can we have a round of applause, please? Thank you both so much for such a wonderful discussion. We're going to open it up to questions from our in-person audience and our Zoom audience who can't see me right now. Hello, Zoom audience. I'm over here. Please send your questions into the chat and we will read them out. So we'll start with people who are here in person. Raise your hand, and Alfonso will bring you the microphone. Don't be shy. We have 13 whole minutes. There we go. Yes, someone in the back. Alfonso.
I came in a little bit late, so sorry if you've already talked about this, but I'm a writer myself, and I was wondering what your publication and editorial process was like.
With this book?
Yes.
Well, it's a very short question. It's very different. It's very different. I think the editorial process from book to book. This one was I wrote this very quickly. I usually spend years writing a book, and this one I wrote in 3 months. Or I wrote the core material, if that makes sense, very, very quickly, kind of in a rush. That's I hope I will be able to experience it again. It doesn't come very often. And then there's an editorial process of not very long. It was pretty much, was more of a detail work with my editor, who is very good at asking all the questions I don't want. And I have to kind of reply to them. And it always makes it better. But this was a very, this book was very strange and unusual process, actually, because normally it takes years. So it's, yeah. And then in Norway, we have a very short publication process. I don't know how to explain this in English. I think it's been it's very different from the American rhythm of publication. So yeah.
Do you ever write in English? And if so, how does that change the output? Like, do you find yourself to be a different person if you write in English or a different writer?
Good question. I don't write fiction in English. Or sometimes maybe a sentence comes in English and I have to translate it. And I have written a couple of essays in English that are online, I think. But it is interesting how you kind of change some kind of tone. But I mean, I feel it's difficult to write in English. I'm not fluent when I write, and it's kind of, but it is a different way of writing. It has its advantages to be in a different country and to think differently. And I love the English language. I mean, I wish I could write more fluently in it, but yeah, it's not a very good question. Answer, a very good question.
Hi, thank you so much for coming, both of you. I loved what you said. I love fiction, but I'm skeptical of it. Do you feel the same way about narrative nonfiction, or is it just the first person? Can you say more about that, please?
Yeah. The narrative nonfiction, I have to translate it into my Norwegian mind. I think one of the nonfiction genres that make me extra skeptical is the biography genre, because I love reading. I mean, I have to say I love reading children's schools essays. I love biography, the language of. I read I think I'm always very confused and surprised when I read where certain biographies, not all biographies are just as super certain about the person they're writing about. But I am always questioning, how do you really know this? How do you know that this actually happened the way that you claim that things happened? How did Rimbaud feel when he was looking at, how can the biographer know all this? And that's one of the things that kind of, I think, has created that kind of skepticism towards the kind of knowledge you kind of pretend to have with certainty in perhaps than in a non-fiction text, but also in a fiction text. I mean, in my first novel, I'm using a we narrator. This is a novel called Wait, Blink. It is available in English, and so you can see for yourself. And there's a because I think when there's a sentence like she was walking down the street and it was raining, then I will think, but how do I know that? How do I know that she was walking down the street, and how do I know that it was raining? So I kind of have to kind of implement that critical uncertainty of myself looking at someone walking down the street raining. No, well, that would be quite interesting if someone was walking down the street raining and it was raining. Okay, new short story. But yeah, no, this is getting too long, but I think I try to get into a thought about non-fiction as well. Mm. Mm.
I had a question about the metafiction section. When you were going about that, was this a materialization of notes that you took along the way, or was that section questions that you had with the editor and you two formulated it together afterwards? How did you kind of approach that part of the short story collection?
Yeah, thank you. No, that's an organic part of writing the short stories. It's kind of a reflex almost, and sometimes because this objection will just turn up and present itself, and then there's a new short story. So it's I think particularly in this one, it's an organic part of the question and the creative process, really. Mm. Mm.
Hey, so the really subversive nature of some of the transformations that we heard about tonight, do you think that that itself is a reflection of this kind of like epistemological doubt that you seem to have about the nature of like fiction itself?
Yeah, I think that's very correct. So difficult to elaborate on, but I think it's a very good reading, yeah, or a good suggestion. But also I think the transformation aspect has something to do with well, you were asking about the subversive nature of fiction, and I'm going to do it answer it in a anecdotal way. So that's maybe not the right way to go about it, but I was just thinking that the transformation was also something that had to do with the nature of the world at the moment when I was writing them. Yeah, so I think the subversive and the apocalyptic feelings kind of merged into Evil Flowers.
This 2019, 2021.
It was just before the pandemic, and so the Evil Flowers, the title is kind of also touching upon that, I think. Yeah. Well, thank you for a very good question.
I might have, this might be like a very basic question, so I apologize in advance, but I've always wondered how people who write kind of, like you mentioned, your fiction is somewhere between like absurdist and a little bit of realism. I wonder how you come up with your ideas with like the concept for these short stories that you write, because like what inspires you basically to with the context that you write in.
Well, thank you. That's a very good basic question. And it's very difficult to answer because it changes. I never know. I think it's coincidences to give a very terrible answer. And it's also well, I have a habit of visualizing sentences or words, taking them, making them concrete. There is my first short story collection is called Knots, and there's I'm quoting a text by Roland Barthes, the literary philosopher. I think it goes something like, the object assumes an exalted place in the discourse. That's the sentence by Barthes. But then I visualize the object. So I see kind of a green, luminous object, kind of a sci-fi object, and that it takes an elevated place in the discourse and kind of moves like a spaceship. That's kind of the way I kind of visualize that sentence. And I think a lot of my ideas comes from language. In that manner, I kind of literalize the content, or I visualize the content, and that makes a kind of an absurd meeting point between something that is kind of intellectual and also very absurd and banal. So that's you can try at home. I ruined my husband's way of looking at the news, because I told him how I kind of visualize or literalize what the news reporter was saying, and then he said, I can't watch the news anymore. So you can try that.